Hello noble ones and welcome to Metatron's Academy. Today we are comparing the Okinawan language with standard Japanese. Now I know that there are some people out there that consider the Okinawan language or Uchināguchi to be a dialect of Japanese. I tend to disagree, but regardless of how you want to consider it, regardless of the nomenclature that you use, if you are a fluent speaker of Japanese, and I happen to be one, can you still recognize, for example, something as basic as the colors in the Okinawan language? And for your reference, I have a degree in Japanese and I lived in Japan for 4 years. Let's go. As always, you'll find link to the original creators in the description. Go check them out and subscribe if you like what you see.
Uchināguchi iru.
Already he says iru to mean colors. In Japanese would be iro. So same pitch, just a slight difference in the final vowel.
Kuru.
So interesting. So black seems to be kuru. In standard Japanese would be kuro. Opposite pitch. But I think I could recognize it within if some context is given. Okay, this one is completely different. Blue, unrecognizable. In standard Japanese it would be ao.
Masara.
Masara. Very cool. So they have a separate one for a deeper blue. Once again, I wouldn't have recognized that at all.
Mijiru.
This one is fascinating. So it says blue water, so maybe some kind of aquamarine. So he pronounces it like mijiru, and I wouldn't recognize it if I hear it, but if I saw the way he writes it with the kanji here, I would recognize it because those are the exact same kanji that are used in Japanese. It's just that they would be pronounced mizuiro, so color of the water. You can read it suishoku, but I've heard most Japanese read it mizuiro. If a person from Okinawa wrote it down, I would recognize it. And also, before we continue, just want to do a mini disclaimer. I know I'm saying kanji because I'm speaking English, so I'm adapting the pronunciation to English so it doesn't sound awkward. I will, however, say it once how it's supposed to be pronounced in Japanese. It's a heiban pattern, so accentless, number 0, and we will be pronounced kanji. Kanji wa muzukashii. I said it once. That doesn't work in English though. Imagine if I had to say, today we're going to talk about the kanji, and what I like about the kanji is that kanji doesn't work. Too awkward. So I said it once. From now on, I'm just going to adapt it to English and say kanji. Great.
Chairu.
Yeah, this I would recognize. The pitch is pretty much the same, and it's chairo in Japanese. So color of tea. Of course, the word for tea, the pronunciation of tea being Sino-Japanese, and in this case, clearly, once again, connected to Chinese, where it's cha, very recognizable, and written the exact same way.
Kugani.
This would have been difficult for me. The same concept, though, in standard Japanese, it would just be pronounced kingiro, so once again, color of gold. Whereas here, it seems like they just say gold, so they skipped the color part.
Feiru.
Once again, unrecognizable. In standard would be hairo, not recognizable, but spelled the same kanji, so if it's written down, I would recognize it.
O.
Wow, this one is maybe one of the most different ones. Green. They just say o. So interesting. In Japanese, that would be midori, same kanji. And oru is greenish blue. Wow. That shouldn't really surprise us though, because blue and green are often mixed depending on what language you're looking at. Sometimes they are the same word. Orange.
Kabuchi.
Kabuchi. So they do have basically the kanji to write orange. Now in Japanese, this is an interesting one because you would normally, if you go to Japan, you will hear katakana, so basically English, but in the Japanese way, and you will hear orenji. But they do have like an ancient word for it, and which would be something like daidairo. I'm not sure about the pitch on this one. The only time in 4 years in Japan, I've always just heard orenji, but the only time where I've seen it written and used was when I was practicing karate. It was Kyokushin karate. I got my orange belt, and on the document, the certificate, they didn't write orenji obi, but they wrote daidairo. So they did use the, I think, classical, more formal way of saying it. And it's a similar situation when it comes to, for example, pink, which in modern Japanese they just say pinku, but they do have a more classical way of saying it, which is bara no iro, which literally means the color of roses, which which personally I think sounds better. But I suppose to the Japanese, pinku and orenji sound more exotic, so that's why they use them. So in this case, it seems like they're more conservative as a language. They tend to stick to tradition rather than taking English stuff and putting it into it, I believe. That's what at first glance.
むむいる
And that exactly proves my point. So for pink, they're not going the mainland way of saying just pinku, but they go for this mumuiru, which basically, as I can recognize the kanji, and it kind of sounds similar to what would be momoiro in Japanese, so the color of peach, which again they don't really use in standard Japanese, but I would probably recognize it because mumu sounds like momo and iru sounds like iro, recognizable.
紫
Murasachi. Interesting. So this one is very close to standard Japanese. They use murasaki. So it's just ki becomes chi, and kanji is the same. Pitch is very similar as well. It's a nakadaka pattern, if I'm not wrong, in Japanese. So very similar.
赤
So red, kanji is the same. It's similar to Japanese, but the pitch is opposite when compared to standard or hyojungo. So here he's saying aka. In standard Japanese, it would be aka. But another thing I'm noticing that he's not really writing down is the fact that he seems to be lengthening the final vowel. It's not just that he says aka, and in standard Japanese it's aka, but it sounds more like aka. I think he should have put a little bar there to underline the fact that the vowel seems to be extended.
なんじゃ
Unrecognizable, same kanji. For silver, in Japanese would be gingiro. So similarly to kingiro, you add color after it. So we got the colors. Some I could recognize, some were completely unrecognizable. I want to say most. How about we try a different video now where we see if we can get full-on sentences and let's see how much I can understand.
Japanese, Okinawan,
一つ、
リーチ、
二つ、
ターチ、
三つ、
ミーチ、
四つ、
ユーチ、
五つ。
イチチ。
Okay, so the first 5 numbers already are quite different, but of course you have to consider one thing. I wonder why they went with this selection of numbers in Japanese, because Japanese has a lot of different types of numbers. You can go for the more used 1,2,3,4,5,6,7,8,9,10. You can go with that one, which they didn't. They went with the 1つ、2つ、3つ、4つ、5つ、6つ、7つ、8つ、9つと。Yeah, that one is fine. You use it for like numbering stuff, particularly when it's like stuff that doesn't have their own set. I would have gone with the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. rather than this one, but whatever, let's go.
六つ、
ムーチ、
七つ。
ナナチ。
Okay, I know why they did it. They did it because it's the closer sounding one. But once again, if you just ask a Japanese to count, you tell them to just count from 1 to 10, they will say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They'll use that rather than 1つ、2つ、3つ、4つ、5つ、6つ、7つ、8つ、9つと. So I think it would have been better to use the other one.
八つ、
ヤーチ、
九つ、
ククヌチ、
と、
トゥ、
Fascinating that they have 2, because that combination, that mora, doesn't exist in Japanese. You never have 2 in Japanese. Let's see sentences as story.
天におられる私たちの父よ、皆が生とされますように。
Tiun nakay imenseru wata uyaganashi.
Okay, so I'm weirded out by the fact that they chose the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven. I wonder why they went with this rather than something more traditional Japanese. It still works with me because when I was in Japan, I used to go to a Christian church, and I'm very familiar with Christian terminology, prayers and all of that. Bible in Japanese. So again, it works for me. I know the Lord's Prayer in Japanese, so absolutely. 天におられる私たちの父よ. Yeah, that one is fine. I understood everything in Japanese. I understood nothing in the Okinawan version.
Na agamirachi utabi misori.
御国が来ますように、御心が天に行われる通り、地にも。
Ukuni fichiyushiti utabi misori. Ukukuru no tiun uti yunugutu chi utiun utabi misori.
So once again, I am understanding nothing of the Okinawa version, everything of the Japanese version. And it's interesting because I'm noticing another characteristic. They have the sound T, which also does not exist in standard Japanese.
私たちの日ごとの糧を今日もお与えください。
Me nachi no hamme chu utabi misori.
Okay, so I think we got the gist of it. I understand nothing of Uchināguchi when they do something like this. Now, I don't know how formal of a language it is, though, so we might, maybe for another video, we might need to select something a bit more basic once again, like hello, goodbye, or maybe people just talking to each other. But for this, I want to underline one thing. So even in the Japanese part, maybe you do know Japanese, and you still might have not recognized some of the words here. There is a reason. It's not that you just forgot Japanese. Let me explain it. So in the Japanese version, when it goes, watashi no higoto no kate, the word kate, to translate give us our daily bread, and you'll be like, but isn't bread pan in Japanese? It is. But when you go into formal or specific and sometimes even academic language, what happens is that you will find words like kate. Now, the word kate or kate, like katewa, I think they're both acceptable. The word kate in Japanese, even though it's translating food. It's not really saying give us our daily bread, it's saying give us a daily food. But even food, you might be familiar with much more popular words in Japanese, such as tabemono, kuimono, shokumotsu. And all of these would be used. You could live 20 years in Japan and hear these three, mostly tabemono, and never hear kate. Because kate, even though it does translate food into food, and I think in the original Mandarin, liang, it would be more like grain/food, because I think I've heard, once again in Mandarin, when you say food, you say 食物 rather than saying like this, like 食粮 or 粮食. You could maybe be a bit more technical rather than everyday language, but in Japanese, kate, it's more like provisions, to give you an example in English. Yeah, I think that one is a good translation actually of kate, and that's why you didn't recognize that word if you didn't. Not because you don't know the word for bread, but because they're not saying bread. It's give us our daily provisions is what they're actually saying. Regardless, I understood absolutely nothing of the Uchināguchi version. This is fascinating stuff. I think I definitely want to make a second episode into which I try to see if there are other occasions where I can understand, but so far, without experiment and test, as a fluent speaker of Japanese, I understood absolutely nothing, and I could only pick a couple of colors, some of which I could only recognize because of the kanji. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Metatron's Academy, and if you want me to make more, please let me know in the comments below.